This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. I'm talking today remotely to Andrew Pogue and Nick Pauley from Fair Isle Brewing in Seattle, Washington. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thanks.
Hey, everyone.
Andrew's co-founder, Nick's head brewer. Fair Isle is a relatively new, not entirely new, but been around for a year and a half or so.
Not even a year.
Not even a year. You're that fresh.
Yeah.
Okay, not new to the world of brewing, certainly, in terms of personal history, but in terms of brewery life, Fair Isle. In the meantime, I feel like I've tasted, at least a dozen of your beers in this short time period, focusing on farmhouse ales and rather specialists. But Fair Isle, I think you guys do a really fun job of exploring tighter possibilities within that world of farmhouse ales, rather than just simply focusing on new, crazier, wilder, bigger, bolder, outlandish things. You are certainly experimenting, but within a nice, narrow, sophisticated range, and the beers exhibit a polish and a beauty that kind of defies the age of your brewery. And so we're going to talk a little bit about mixed culture brewing, farmhouse brewing, your approach to it. I don't know if you call it farmhouse because you're in an urban neighborhood of Ballard in Seattle, and it's not exactly farmhouse. I say I will let you guys address that. Before we do, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. New this year, redundancy meets efficiency. G&D's micro-channel condensers are built with all aluminum construction, which eliminates galvanic corrosion. Using half the refrigerant of conventional condensers with fewer brazed connections translates to a lower GWP and less opportunity for leaks. Call G&D Chillers today to discuss your project or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, haze for days in your IPAs. Carry Biohaze from BSG adds that perfect, stable, cloudy appearance for your hazy recipe. Made with all natural materials, Biohaze is a free-flowing, microgranular powder that binds with protein molecules in beer that form polyphenol protein complexes to produce a cloudy haze. This unique product can be added to final beer to give your beer that famous haze. Find out more about Biohaze at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact them at 1-800-374-2739. So, Andrew, why don't you give us the lowdown on Fair Isle, your brewing history, and then a short history of the brewery, and then Nick, we can talk about your brewing history too after that.
Yeah, so Fair Isle opened earlier this year in January. We were open for just shy of 8 weeks before the state of Washington shut down for COVID. So we've exhibited and brewed and been open to customers in COVID longer than we've been open up in normal time. So to some extent, COVID is pretty normal for us, and we've learned to operate in that, and I'm excited to kind of show the world and engage with our customers and guests in a post-COVID world, hopefully later this year.
In terms of brewing history, what did you do before launching Fair Isle?
Yeah, so I grew up in Texas and then moved to Austin, Texas after graduating from college to pursue being an architecture photographer. While I was in Austin, my now wife, we were dating at the time, but her dad taught me how to homebrew. And then through homebrewing, met Joshua Cockrell, the artist behind the Just a King brand. Started homebrewing with him and his brother. And then through that, met Jeffrey and Michael at Just a King. And they kind of were influential and kind of like sharing what mixed culture beer and kind of like the greater craft beer industry and what that is. And then that kind of like started the seed of wanting to start a brewery myself. And then moving up to Seattle, met up with Jeffrey Barker, my business partner. We met at the North Seattle Homebrew Club. And then we were both kind of entering a phase where we were looking at doing the brewery as a business and not so much a hobby anymore. And then quickly kind of realized we had similar interests and visions for what a brewery could look like. We were also both at the time independent. So we were working, he was doing independent IT stuff. I was doing independent as a photographer. And so we were looking for that collaborative nature and what a partnership could look like. And that kind of started Fair Isle.
Nick, talk to me about your background in brewing.
Yeah, kind of like many pro brewers out there, I started as a home brewer as well. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, joined the Snobs Homebrew Club when I was about 20 years old. Our buddy and I, just started brewing in our garage and got real serious about it for a few years there. The president of the homebrew club kind of took me under his wing, and we brewed some crazy stuff, and your classics as well. So rambling on about that. So that was all during college. I went to college for mechanical engineering, and did the desk job life for a couple of years there, and decided that wasn't my pathway, wasn't my calling at all. Doing HVAC design and plumbing and all that. So I decided
skills
to
that
enroll
would come back and help you later brewery life for sure.
Oh, no doubt. Oh, no doubt. Absolutely. But I feel like I do actually like more engineering on a day-to-day basis as a brewer than I did, working behind a desk and moving lines around sometimes, so.
Sure.
So kind of towards the end of my tenure as an engineer, I decided to enroll in the Concise course at Siebel. Love that. Great experience. Got to hang out in Chicago for a few weeks and, taking the great craft beer scene there. And then ended up landing a job as a production brewer at Santan Brewing Company in Phoenix, Arizona. Spent a few years there producing wort mostly. Got to learn on some nice big toys, centrifuge, 50-barrel brew house, all the filters you could think of, 200-barrel fermenters and whatnot. But really wanted to get more into, I guess, like the brew pub experience, getting more and more involved in all the nuances of the craft beer world, having my hands kind of on everything from grain to glass, really. So had an opportunity to join the team at Arizona Wilderness Brewing Company, right up the street. And it's been about 2.5 years there, working with one of my best buddies, Chase Saraiva, who is now the head brewer down in Australia at Wildflower Brewing Company.
Oh, cool.
So we got to do some pretty crazy stuff at Arizona Wilderness. Not sure if you're familiar.
Oh, for sure.
We kind of ran the gamut, brewing everything from hazy IPAs, stouts, saisons. We did some cool ship stuff. Used a bunch of foraged ingredients, and man, I was just smitten by all that, and just wanted. I know
we've got an article on beerandbrewing.com about some of the wild cool ship stuff that Arizona Wilderness has done, and if folks want to read more about that, for sure, go back.
Yeah.
So how'd you end up in Seattle?
Yeah, I just decided, being a Northeast Ohio kid, just couldn't handle the desert heat much longer. Was there for 4.5-ish years, and I just wanted to see a little bit more of this side of the world. Got an opportunity to join Fair Isle about 1.5 years ago, something like that. During the still in the construction phases, so got my hands in some plumbing, some bending conduit. And then now we've been producing wort on our own for not quite a year, but yeah.
So Andrew, you decide to launch a new brewery. It's a dense brewing market, and why focus as tightly as you have on this kind of farmhouse oeuvre with the kind of narrowness that entails?
I think that's kind of twofold, or two reasons why. One is that's what I enjoy to drink. If I'm going to drink a beer, I pretty much drink lagers or farmhouse beers exclusively. This is what I enjoy. And from a consumer standpoint, there's not That's kind of hard to do. Like, there's not a lot of saisons available where you could actually drink a saison every day, without necessarily like cracking open these kind of saisons that most people might like say for a special occasion. Like, I enjoy the part of like the rich Belgian tradition of having like an everyday saison, and then my own personal philosophy, going back to like choosing to focus only on architecture photography. I feel like my own personal philosophy is to focus on a narrow niche of whatever you do, and do that really, really well. And so that kind of was a really easy decision for me to just do mixed culture beers. We did a lot of market research before starting, came up with some rough numbers of less than like 1% of the market share being these mixed culture beers. So to me, it gave a no-brainer of plenty of room available for a brewery that even in a crowded market isn't actually in a very crowded market of mixed culture beers. And then kind of like having this belief that there's many other people like me in Seattle and in Washington that would love to have access to more mixed culture beers that that don't, because Washington's a predominantly hop focused state.
So does price figure into this? You mentioned every day, and you're right. When you release saisons, and generally that mode, if you were looking at I shouldn't say that. There are wonderful examples like Hill Farmstead Arthur and Anna that are $10 or $12 for a bottle, and can be consumed as everyday beers. But then there's also plenty of $30 plus fruited, highly specialized kinds of beers in that kind of category. For you all, how do you balance that intention to be something that people can drink on a daily basis and not just as this privileged or precious thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we definitely take price into consideration a lot. Our beers do take longer to produce than most beers. Our typical saison, like Madam, is almost 9 weeks from brew to consumer. So that's a long time than like an IPA, even like a long time for a lot of lagers.
Sure.
So there is a price point that follows that. At the same time, like the beauty of our beers, lots of times you're not just necessarily drinking the quantity that most people drink, like a lager and IPA. So our price pours at the brewery, at the tasting room, are kind of equivalent to anybody else's IPAs on our like stainless saisons, which is kind of like so far has made up a majority of the beers we've released to the public, partly because of their timeline, that being 90 days. And then so we kind of like taking a step back, we kind of think about our beers in two families. One's the beers that are meant for drinking and enjoying, an everyday beer, and the other beers that are meant for experiencing, that you can and be willing to put away in a cellar. And so we kind of have two of those families going. I don't necessarily think that our philosophy isn't as such where that we are never going to produce these beers that you should crack open for celebration,
Sure.
But we should have the gamut of it.
That makes sense. Let's actually start moving in and talking about some of the specific approaches to beers. Given this bigger world of Farmhouse and some of the unique, kinds of imprints that different brewers, put on their beers, I'm really curious to see how you all have gone about forming an identity, for Fair Isle. But before we do that, the most common complaint about hard seltzers: they need more flavor. Extract alone is a weak flavoring agent and can leave a chemical aftertaste, but there's a better way. The craft concentrate blends from Old Orchard are packed with real fruit first, no added sugars, and just enough natural flavor. Breweries are turning to Old Orchard concentrates for seltzer with more body, color, and aroma. Turn seltzer skeptics into supporters with seltzers that drink like a beer. Get started at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, for years, Brewery DB has been the industry's only professionally curated source of brewery and beer information and responsible for mapping millions of visits to breweries all across the United States. In early 2021, Brewery DB will reveal a whole new platform with all new marketing features for breweries to attract craft lovers to their unique brewery experience. To take full advantage of the enhanced marketing power of Brewery DB and to increase your taproom traffic, visit marketmybrewery.com. That's marketmybrewery.com. It's easy and it's free. So let's talk about that kind of formative process, and you can both kind of speak to this because you were both involved in this. When you come up with the idea to create a farmhouse focused brewery, there are a whole myriad of different ways to do that in terms of, trying to build an idea of terroir, of focusing on creativity and different kinds of ingredients, of appealing to, family history and past, for you all. And then there's that whole question of a culture and how that produces beers that have a kind of flavor that becomes associated with the brewery itself. So walk me through some of that kind of process of building an identity for Fair Isle in terms of what the beers will taste like and what consumers will continuously expect from those beers.
Early on, I think one thing that Jeffrey and I really realized that the best thing that we could do was to create different environments and give our house culture time it needs to really excel and do its own thing. So part of what we had to do, almost the biggest part of what we are doing, is almost stepping aside and letting our culture kind of be the star of the show. And so within that, that kind of like being the foundation of how we kind of discover these beers. And correct me or push me in a different direction if you want me to go in a different direction. But because of that being like the foundation, talk to me about the genesis of the culture itself. How did it come about? Is this something that you had developed as a home brewer? Is this, is there a different means that you've gone about? Did you, find some cultures that you enjoyed that were commercially available, build, blend, grow, develop? What became that kind of foundation for flavor at Fair Isle? Yeah. So when I first moved up to Seattle, I really wanted to find a culture that represented the Northwest, and not specific to Seattle, but just the Northwest in general. And so when we would go out on hikes on the weekends, when up in the Cascades, which is the big mountain range just east of us, or when we'd go over to the wine region of Yakima, which is just beyond those as well. And then just hiking around the area, like I would gather different flowers and plants, and I would come back and put them in fresh wort, and I would propagate things up. And then just through time and sensory analysis and natural selection, we kind of found different cultures that we liked the flavors of, and we started blending with those. We still used a few commercial yeast strains too, like there's like resemblance of a DuPont strain in our house culture. But one of the words that we use to describe our house culture is feral. All yeast was once wild at one point. We brought it in and isolated it, became domestic. But now we're on a few hundredth generation of our house culture. It is no longer domesticated. So it's become feral. So we have a cocktail of wild yeast and bacteria that we use to ferment all of our beers with. And we pitch one batch to the next. Jeffrey and I have been kind of using this culture for about 4 years now, before the brewery ever started. So it's kind of got this long history of being somewhat now predictable. It still changes, still evolves. But at least now we know ways we can push it in different directions. We know how to create different environments so that different parts of the culture are going to excel in different ways. And then even exploring now with like these nuanced grains, how they interact too. So that's kind of like the root of the house culture that we use.
Have you done any kind of analysis on it, or have you also banked it in case things shift off in other weird directions and need to kind of reset a little bit?
Yeah, so in 2018, we banked it at White Labs. So we've even thought about recently like bringing it back and doing a side-by-side and seeing how it's changed.
How much drift do you kind of see through that? And then we can kind of move from there and talk about some of the levers that you push and pull in order to move it in different directions.
Initially, we saw huge drifts, like let's say like year 1 through 2 of using the house culture. But since then, and really since like just prior to getting it banked, even like we noticed a somewhat stability to it. We found out ways where we could bring it back to being more of a restrained tartness when it starts to drift more into tartness. There is probably like, and Nick can speak more to this. Over the last 18 months, it's definitely, as we've been like watching the pH, it's definitely still drifting slightly more tart. There's ways that we brew to kind of eliminate that, but it's still like this very, very slow drift. It isn't a wild swing though. Madam Batch 1 now, which is our house saison, tastes similar enough to 3-4 batches down the road.
Yeah, as Andrew was saying, one of the big things we try to really tamp down is the lactic acid bacteria component of the culture. I'm not exactly sure what exact species and strains are involved. I just kind of shepherd that culture around and give it a variety of precursor compounds to kind of chew on, and from there, go in whatever direction it might. But yeah, so as far as the lactic acid bacteria, we're not doing anything too crazy. Just its hopping rates and IBU. We're generally around like the 25 to 30 IBU range for almost everything we do. If it's going to see fruit, or depending on like kind of what we're trying to release, right? Maybe we want a little bit more acidity to give it some more like quenching properties, but in general, we like a kiss of tartness. So these beers are finishing not much lower than, I'd say, 3.6 pH is kind of the low end. I'd say they're more close to, the 3.8s, 3.9s pretty consistently.
And yeah, you're right, it's tart, but they're not sour. At least on the farmhouse side. I think some of the fruited stuff may, kind of tilt a little bit more acidic, but there's a subtlety to it, and you're right, it doesn't kind of overpower. So IBU is a main component. You mentioned feeding the culture with different precursors in order to kind of push different flavor expressions in the beer. Talk to me a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, I mean, even as the basic stuff, as far as pitch rates or oxygenation levels, will kind of help determine what sort of like ester profile you're starting with. Again, still being pretty early on, we are just gathering data, and this is very much like an iterative thing.
Sure.
But yeah, hopping rates are going to change your ester production, your O2 rates. We generally ferment around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and then let free rise. Usually ends this time of year, maybe 90 degrees. Summers mid 90s. So yeah, that just creates different environments for the culture to express itself, and then over time, should one of our branches goes into barrels. So how the culture deals with micro aeration throughout wood stays for prolonged periods. We've had beers in barrels for maybe as long, I think 9 months is one of our older barrels, and just kind of seeing how that has transformed from 6 weeks in the tank, it being kind of a more secondary metabolite, kind of like ester profile, like your and phenol profile as well, your clove and all that, how that transforms down the line, and just how it changes over the course of 6 months is it's really interesting to watch and experience and taste through, and just see how much.
Talk to me more about that. I'm curious. So you were saying that after that tank fermentation, you end up with some relatively common, flavors from the more typical kind of farmhouse saison, but that those flavors then metabolize into other flavors.
Yeah. So. I think the word, for esters, I believe it's like esterification. So how those compounds kind of break down via Brettanomyces metabolism. So they change from very typical clove, and your kind of banana esters will change into, utilizing compounds provided by the grain and the hops into beautiful like floral, violet, lilac kind of characteristics. your typical woodsy, herbal, cinnamon kind of compounds that aren't derived from adding any of those herbs and spices, but just from hanging out in wood for a while.
Are there specific choices that you make on the front end of the brewing process in order to maximize some of that future expression as the culture moves through that fermentation process?
Yeah, so depending on like what the ultimate goal of a batch is, we have a 15-barrel brew house, so and we have a couple 30-barrel fermenters, so we'll double batch and maybe we'll split half and kind of serve it young, so about 6 weeks residence time in tank, and then we'll package that as is. But the other half will go to barrels, and we'll treat that fermentation differently, definitely. And if a whole batch were to go to barrels, we would mash a little bit higher. We would maybe consider using a higher percentage of raw grains. And when I say mash higher, anywhere from as low as 154 to I just did a kind of like single infusion turbid emulation batch. So we mashed at about 165, 167, somewhere in that range. So yeah, so creating that composition to give a little bit more of a dextrinous wort, a little bit more complex carbohydrates to allow the culture to manipulate that wort profile in oak, just to give it more and more food to kind of hang out and chew. Not as long as
slow down the process, give everything time to work as it kind of moves through. And then
we'll suppress the temperature during fermentation as well. So maybe we'll knock those out at 68 and kind of choke it off around 70. Let the sack kind of settle down and leave a little bit of room for the other guys to express themselves later on.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about grain. I mentioned it earlier, but you all have been working a lot in, again, this kind of tighter sphere, trying to find new expressions by using differing ingredients. And some of that has been a focus on heirloom grains. Talk to me a little bit about the kind of foundation of that program and what you've learned through brewing with some of these interesting things.
Part of our initial desire, I think Nick and I were tag team this one. So part of our initial desire to work with these heirloom grains is just kind of exploring and sharing with everybody the bounty that the Northwest has to offer. And that's not just hops, but it's also grains. A cool thing that most people probably don't know about the Northwest is that we don't just have one craft maltster, we have 4 craft maltsters producing a huge variety of grains. And so not only do you have like one barley to choose from, I think we have like a dozen or more different barleys, all grown in different geographical parts of the Northwest too, that all are completely different. So for us too, it's just a chance for us to play and explore, and how does our yeast culture react with these heirloom grains. When we design recipes, we were super, super simple. So we're not adding a lot. So these little minute moves of working with a barley in the Skagit Valley versus a barley in Eastern Washington versus a barley in Oregon, has big ripple effects down the road. So for us, that's just super fantastic and fascinating. And it's been a great way for us to connect locally with the ecosystem of the Pacific Northwest too, and connecting with the local maltster and knowing who the farmer is that we are buying the grain from, and kind of understanding and talking to them about what they know and what they've learned from this grain, and sharing their knowledge. And then as we kind of take that, that's kind of how we're able to kind of combine and explore these recipes.
Let's talk about some of the specific grains that you all have brewed with, and then also think about what, from your perspective, those have added or contributed in terms of uniqueness to flavors of the beers. Is there one off the top of your head that strikes you as particularly interesting, and then we can kind of work through some of the others, talking about what they are, how they worked in the brewing process, and then how the flavors ended up influencing the end beers.
Yeah, I'll tag team this with Nick. So earlier this year, or actually about a year ago, we got a bunch of grain called Salish Blue. It's not a barley. It's not a wheat. It's a new perennial grain variety that Western Washington and the Bread Lab have kind of created. So it's one of the only perennial grains ever. So I don't know if people know much about grains, but most grains aren't perennial. That means they have to replant every year. So this being kind of a radical thing in the farm world. So we were able to, Eric, kind of our rep for Skagit Valley Malting, reached out to us, talked about this new grain they had available that they had just done a small pilot batch, and we quickly jumped on it. Because our culture has a huge attenuation rate, we really enjoy playing with high-end adjuncts in our beer. So Salish Blue maybe kind of resembles what we think of a typical white wheat. And we do a batch of beer, so to speak, with about 50% barley and 50% Salish Blue malt. So a pretty high adjunct beer. And what it did is it gave this beautiful creamy mouthfeel that you might expect from a wheat. And then just played with these nuanced flavor notes that sometimes are often hard to describe. The best way to describe them is to sit and drink through all of our beers, knowing that they're all pretty much made with the same yeast and only minute differences of hops, and then you can really start to understand the contribution of these little moves.
I have enjoyed doing that this year with the beers that you've sent to us, but people listening are going to have to channel through.
They do.
You'll live vicariously through. And the beer that I'm drinking right now, the Season 1 Batch E, is brewed with Salish Blue, and so I'm actually tasting it right now. And yes, it's creamy as you describe it, and of course, this beer in particular has a nice funky nose to it, and a particularly Belgian kind of approach. But that's interesting. So Salish Blue is not actually wheat or barley; it is its own grain.
Yeah, it's its own species. It was a cross between a bread flower and lemongrass. So maybe knowing that, you kind of pick up more notes of like lemon and citrus, but then with our culture itself, it's always hard to kind of like figure out what's the line between the it's a very soft blur line between what our culture is doing versus what's the grains.
Yeah, to me early on, so the base beer that we feature as its own brand is called Hannah, and that features the Salish Blue. But to me, kind of early on with that beer, that grain was providing, at least to my palate, notes of almost like a wit beer. So you got kind of this emulated coriander, tangelo, curacao orange kind of vibe. Again, just coming from the combination of the precursors of that grain species and the combination of our house mix culture, which I guess I could speak a little bit to the tasting notes that generally the culture provides. It's kind of your typical lemon, a little bit pepper from the DuPont strain in there. And then, some peach, a little bit of melon. Those are the predominant, like kind of apricot cut notes, like candied apricot.
Moving from Salish Blue, are there some other grains that you've been brewing with that have also added different but also unique and interesting characters to these beers?
So another one we feature in one of our more, or at least a brand that we've brewed more frequently, called Layla, features purple Egyptian barley. It is a hulless barley. The brand layer is, I'm cheating off my notes here, so hope you don't mind.
I'm going to open a bottle of Layla while you reference your notes there.
Oh, great. Yeah. So it's called a purple barley, hulless, but the brand layer's got a glossy purplish black component that unfortunately kind of drops off pretty early on to fermentation. And there's a little bit of color to the wort, but nothing too crazy. It provides this beautiful, almost spicy rye component, like nutty rye, but really just shines and just ends up in a really nice, drinkable, crisp, but like a firm rye-esque backbone, I guess. But coming from a barley species as well, which definitely helps. We use 50% of this grain, so 50-50, a Pilsner variety and the purple Egyptian variety. But but it being a barley variety definitely helps on the brew house. Lauter's a lot nicer. Fewer beta glucans and gums and all that fun stuff. It makes for a nice brew day.
Yeah, I guess that would be a question with like something like the Salish, pushing that with these high adjunct 50/50 mashes has to pose in technical issues and challenges for you.
For sure, yeah. Thankfully, we've got a nice brew house from North Coast Metal Design down in Portland. It handles grain really well. A few months back, we did a Coit, like a Dutch Coit inspired beer. So kind of semi-traditional. It was about 45% malted black oats from Skagit Valley Malting, just up north. And then on top of that, 20% malted white wheat. I lautered pretty damn well. I think we did just like a 2-step infusion and no issues. The hold oats definitely help, but yeah, so it's really fun to kind of feature those grains in high percentages to really let those focus and be take up that backbone.
Did some of this idea that you were going to be focusing this way influence the way that you all built out and spec'd the brew house?
It did, yeah. So we, like Matt over at North Coast, did a fantastic job. Like the first conversations were, what do you guys brew? Let's talk about your beers, and let's design a system specifically for that. And it was always like, yes, let's rise to the challenge and figure that out. Our typical range of our beers are probably from like 8 to 14 Plato, maybe 8 to 12 is most of them. So we're kind of like a low Plato beer producer. But because we do a bunch of adjuncts in almost 100% of our beers, and some of them are pretty high adjuncts, that's something that he took in consideration and designed.
So while the stout brewers are building gigantic mash tuns relative to their smaller kettles, you guys just need really strong rake motors.
Exactly, yeah. It's a monster.
And our brew house itself will allow us to do like a 15 barrel, like almost equivalent of an imperial stout, which we do on the rare occasion. And then we have an oversized kettle, so we can do 25 barrels of like a really low 6 or 7 Plato beer.
So how much does Farmhouse beer make up of everything that you brew, or does everything that you brew get moved through house culture?
Yeah, I
know you're still early in this whole, with 1 year in, and I imagine stories could change down the road, but at this point, what does it look like?
We haven't brewed anything that doesn't use our house culture.
Wow.
So everything, we have 15 saisons on the board that are ours. We have a guest IPA or a guest lager sometimes, and that's it.
How do you then, so you, even though you're keeping things relatively tight, what are some of the other means of differentiation between these saisons and farmhouse ales that you all have developed in order to, create different experiences for your consumers?
Yeah, I think grains being one of the ones that we already talked about. We do use hops. We don't shy away from hops. We have 2 beers, Bobby, which is kind of like a version of like a kind of a Northwest, New American, New World hoppy kind of pale ale. And we have another beer we call that actually just a rotating super hoppy beer that where you actually use the second use of the mosaic hops from Bobby to brew the other one. So we do use hops. We also have different environments, everything from stainless steel to foeders to oak puncheons to spirit barrels, and then just using kind of the wide variety of other adjuncts from fruit to foraging ingredients to the cascades to using bread from a local bakery to brew Voss. Like, to me, there's an enormous amount of range available within these mixed culture beers that it's almost as big a range of like a lager per se, right? Like lagers aren't always pilsners, right? There's a huge range of lagers that you can explore. In the same way with mixed culture beers, there's a huge range of beers that we can explore.
Well, let's talk about some of those ingredients, foraged things, even hops and usage and how you move forward on that. But first, ABS Commercial is excited to be a part of today's podcast. ABS is a full brewery outfitter offering brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts. As part of ABS Commercial's ongoing Give Back campaign, they'll be giving away an ABS Keg Viking keg washer in June. So make sure to periodically check the ABS Commercial Facebook page to find out when the contest opens up and how you can enter to win a Keg Viking. So Nick, why don't you talk to me a little bit about some of the more interesting ingredients, especially on that kind of foraged and ingredient side that speak to your Pacific Northwest terroir.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess so far I'll lead in with the beer I'm actually drinking. Andrew and I are both. We just cracked open it's called Alexandra. It's a beer featuring foraged fireweed, which grows, up here. It almost grows as a weed, right? But typically in areas that have been burned. But yeah, we work with an ethnobotanist, which Andrew could speak about further. But she, kind of goes all around the state and gathers up some really cool samples of things that we might be interested in. And, we get to work from anything from fireweed, rose hips, elderflower. I mean, everything grows up here. So it's almost endless. But yeah, back to the fireweed. To my palate, it provides, notes of like a green tea, very herbal, very, very dry and refreshing. It kind of has that tannic green tea finish. Just makes for a quenching beverage.
What does usage process look like? How do you gather, then prepare, and then get it into the right shape? Figure out dosage within the beer, and then and kind of guide a right expression around it.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as dosage, we have just kind of started up a somewhat pilot system that we call Windward and Leeward. So we're basically utilizing 15-gallon conical fermenters, homebrew conical fermenters, side streaming some wort or some semi-finished green beer, and kind of just playing around with dosing, but with no urgency, to get it out. So we can add a little bit. We can always add a little bit more. But yeah, so typically these foraged ingredients come in dried and vacuum sealed, and pretty much ready for use. It's just up to us to determine how we want to use them. But generally, I'd say most of it is just kind of cold steeped, or ambient temperature steeped. But for this fireweed beer in particular, we did use it hot side. So I kind of borrowed like a hazy IPA cool down whirlpool technique. So I didn't want to boil the fireweed. Consider it kind of like at flame out or whatever, but I actually just chilled the wort to about 190 and then did a steep for I think like 10 minutes or so of the fireweed. Forgive me, I forgot kind of the rate. Yeah, this one was hot side, and we weren't sure if we were going to have to supplement cold side or not, but we determined with this one there was just a in your face kind of fireweed character, right from the kettle, and yeah.
How do you describe fireweed?
The flavor profile or the plant itself?
Both. I'm curious.
Yeah.
I'm trying to visualize this.
Yeah, so the plant itself is an opportunistic weed. It's one of the first things to grow back after a fire, or any kind of like vast amount of land with a bunch of sun to it. And it's a really stocky plant and grows really tall, up to like 6 feet or 8 feet. And it has these kind of slender leaves that come out of it and a beautiful red flower. I'm really bad with the names of flowers, but there's like lots of little flowers up top. So like to some degree, like if you are in Alaska in the summer months, you see these beautiful red fields, which is one reason why people think it's called fireweed. The other being that it's the first thing to pop up after a fire. And so the leaves itself is a part of the plant that we use. So we dry the leaves, and The natives used to use the leaves as a kind of a green tea substitute or black tea substitute. So lots of the characteristics from a flavor profile that you'd expect, like in a green tea, come across in these fireweed too. So that's kind of like the part of the plant that we use. I don't know if people are familiar maybe with us and Jester King. They know that we went and did a collab with them about 3-4 years ago, and we brought down fireweed for that and created a beer called Fair Voyage. And then through that process, that's actually the second time we used it, but through that on a big scale, understanding more of the dosage rate. So with Alexandria, we wanted to do a much more pronounced fireweed note and really celebrate that ingredient. So we doubled the dosage on that.
And then, since this is not really commercially harvested, I mean, who actually cuts it down, processes it, dries it? Is this something that you guys do, or you work with this ethnobotanist who then brings those samples in for you?
Yeah, so Alex is the lady that we work with for all of our foraging, or at least most of our foraging. I've known her for 15, 20 years. We went to college together. And so what she does, she actually has a license in a company and has a permit through the U.S. Forest Service to harvest these kind of wild forage ingredients. And one of the reasons why she first introduced us to fireweed, and she's the one that kind of brought it to our attention, was that it's sustainably harvested. So by going out and grabbing these leaves and grabbing these plants, we're not going to be destroying a habitat, and we're not going to be like potentially like hurting the plant for future generations. So she actually goes out and she harvests them, she dries them and packages them and delivers us almost in the same way that if you were to go buy something from BSG and having
Sure.
like that for.
That's kind of fun, and and it's almost like using kudzu if you're in the South, where like finding something that grows everywhere that is an opportunistic weed like that. Although kudzu is not a native species, where it sounds like fireweed actually is a native species.
It is to the Pacific Northwest, yeah. So it's it'll be from here all the way up to Alaska, and then as well across into Russia.
Well, that's a much better story. Talk to me about some of the other foraged ingredients that you all have been working with and gotten interesting results from.
Yeah, so some of the ones that we've made beer on a kind of a more commercial scale with is the elderberry and elderflower and rose hips. So we actually use elderberry for a fruited beer we called Eleanor. Eleanor being the Celtic kind of like folklore for the goddess of the elderberry plant. So we gather, or Alex gathers, a bunch of elderberries, which come in around like August of every year in the Cascades. So elderberries are kind of one of those fruits that's a lot more labor intensive. So to kind of harvest the elderberry, you cut off the fruit. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with what an elderberry looks like, but it looks kind of like almost how like a grape clump, but instead of being grape size, all the berries almost a pea size. And the best way to harvest those is you freeze them, and they get really hard and when frozen, and then from there you can shake them off and they fall off the stems. So when we work with elderberry, we bring a bunch of frozen ones. We all sit around and watch a movie, and then
Blade Runner.
We watched Blade Runner during. It felt very fitting in August, and then we processed all those elderberries and added it to a tank, and then transfer beer on top of that. And then sometimes, as Nick mentioned earlier, like what we are doing is that we are exploring foraged ingredients on a very tiny scale in a windward and leeward, which is a 15-barrel batch or 15-gallon batch for next season. Because oftentimes what happens is that the season to produce or to harvest these are so short that we are playing with dosing rates and understanding how we wanted to use them, not with a mindset of how we're going to use it this year, but how we're going to use it next year.
I certainly understand that process. It's like every year when we look at Oktoberfest beers or pumpkin beers, because we have a magazine lead time of 3 or 4 months, and then same thing with you. If you have a 90-day lead time, understanding how you want to do it now means you have to plan for next year's kind of process on that. So elderberries, fireweed, any other interesting forage ingredients that have you've found curious to work with?
Yeah, so one of the very early on, small batch series beers that we did was with Hawthorne, which I actually not super familiar with, but Hawthorne and Yarrow. Yarrow's plentiful up here as well, almost grows as a weed, but has just this beautiful, super funky, dank, but floral characteristic. And, obviously is a traditional like gruit herb.
Sure.
So it kind of harkens back to pre-hop days, which we, appreciate for sure at Farmhouse.
Has medicinal properties too.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's healing properties, right? But
I was just
so
watching Rashida Jones talk about it the other day on a television show, and she had yarrow from her garden, and it stopped a bleeding and a cut that she had. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Right on. Yeah. So
sorry, that's neither here nor there. It's a complete distraction.
I haven't seen the show. Love Rashida Jones from The Office days.
Yeah,
for sure. But yeah, so the the yarrow in conjunction with these, they were so the hawthorn berries themselves were kind of very herbal, bitter, kind of woodsy, but we threw a hefty amount into 15 gallons, and they just took on this like fruit punch characteristic, and in conjunction with that yarrow was just mind blowing. And I think something that we're going to consider maybe scaling up. We got some pretty good reception. And then other ingredients, yeah, we've got, salmon berries grow plentiful up here. What else we got?
Are there any, any particulars? Again, you mentioned it's mostly cold steeping. Are there any kind of, unique process approaches as you add things like these berries and yarrow and other kinds of herbs on that cold side in order to get the kind of quality of flavor extraction that you're looking for, or to kind of optimize the way that flavors that you extract work with the kind of culture to become what they're going to become?
Sure. Yeah. I think the thing that we're most concerned about is, kind of like oversteeping or overdoing it and kind of leaching out some of those green components and characteristics. And
right.
We're just getting too vegetal or a little bit too rancid. So it's just a constant, tasting iteration and, just trying kind of every day, multiple times a day even, and just gathering sensory on it. And
multiple times a day? You're sampling from tanks multiple times a day as you're steeping things?
Hey, it's hard work.
All right.
Do you bag? Do
you recirculate? What does that kind of tank process look like?
No, so mostly, if we're doing anything crazy or steeping, we'll generally split off of a batch and do a little bit smaller quantities. Not as small as 15 gallons, but we'll pull into IBC totes. So those max out at about 10 barrels. Fill them with 7 or whatever it might be. But no recirculation. We've only got one pump, so it's kind of hard to tie that up all the time. It's a cold steep and maybe some agitation, with a sanitized spoon or whatever you might get to get a little bit more maceration out of it. That's basically it. Muslin bags are our best friends. So
then, do you? If you're splitting it out into the tote for this kind of steeping process, you then blend that back in with the rest of the batch and then homogenize in order to kind of pull it back in. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, exactly. And
okay,
yeah, and if anything were too intense, we've always got beer to kind of blend back with, or
sure,
adjust as necessary, or throw it in oak and see how it changes and forget about it for a while. No, we haven't had to do that, but.
Were you going to say something, Andrew?
I was going to say some of these batches that we do, we are doing them because forage ingredients are so limited. We are just doing them really, really small scales.
Right.
And so small being like one tote size, which is roughly 7 barrels. So we have like a batch we call Gemma. It's with elderflower and rose hips, and we've played around with that enough where we kind of know the dosing rates of that. So when we add 8 barrels of that to a tote, we dose with that. Still doing sensory and pretty much, like Nick said, pulling it before it gets too vegetable or too weird or too kind of like green in a bad way. So it definitely swings a lot.
Let's talk about hops for a little bit. Obviously this is a part of of your brewing. What's your typical hops approach look like in your farmhouse beers? And then do you have any approaches that stray or vary from that?
Yeah, we use a actually fairly wide array of hops. Generally, the workhorse hop are your classic Hallertau Mittelfrüh. Somewhat low alpha, can get some good utilization out of it. Like I said, we're pushing for like 30 IBU and generally trying to target around a pound of hops per barrel. So you need some low alpha to achieve that. But yeah, other than those. That classic, some Strisel Spalt are always good. Nice 2 alpha range to achieve those goals and get some beautiful, like classic herbal characteristics out of. But then, yeah, as far as the new school stuff goes, for Bobby, as Andrew mentioned, our kind of pale ale, we're using Citra Mosaic on the hot side, your classic hops, and then dry hopping with about a pound per barrel of Mosaic. Yeah. So, and then from the dry hop of that Bobby brand, we are then typically using a second turn on the brew house to cast out wort back into the fermenter that contains that dry hop slurry. I'll dump a little bit of yeast and a little bit of the hop load out. But then basically casting out fresh wort on top of that slurry and playing around with the tons of your residual aromas and flavors that are left over from Mosaic hops. And then typically with that brand, we are then supplementing and dry hopping with a rotating variety of, we've done Sabro, some Citra Lupulin. We're going to place some Nelson Sauvin. But just rotating hops. Again, there is no typical. We're still in the early stages of playing around with these, and
sure.
I think we've only done about 40 turns or so on the brew house.
So let me get this straight: that you will have beer or beers where you are reusing hops. You're pitching fresh wort onto hops that have already. Or a mix of hops and culture that's already fermented another beer?
Yeah, so I'm dropping a little bit of yeast out of there, or at least that slurry, so as to not overpitch and just have a huge yeast load from the previous batch. But then there's still a good amount of the Mosaic dry hop left over in the tank, and any brewer
don't worry about
knows,
cleaning, right?
Yeah, no worry about cleaning. It's the beauty of using the same culture and everything. No worry about cross contamination. But yeah, any brewer knows if you're dumping hops out of a fermenter, they generally, unfortunately, maybe have a little bit more aroma than you want that you're just dumping down the drain. So I remember reading, I believe the ASBC and the Master Brewers Association have done some studies, and I remember just kind of glancing at that, and we kind of had an open-ended, no plans for a specific beer to brew. So I'm like, hey, let's try to see what we can get out of these. And we all end up really liking it. So we've used that as kind of a base beer for, a separate hoppy brand, but also for fruiting. And it can provide, those spent hops can provide a really cool underlying base layer to accentuate. I believe one of the cooler ones we've done were with kiwi berries or hardy kiwi, kind of like kiwis, but they look like a grape in certain ways. And that residual, somewhat subdued Mosaic character really, we felt played well with those kiwi berries.
It's a lot of fun, and Stan Hieronymus has written for us on the same kind of subject of reusing hops. I love second use fruit beers personally because I am biased towards beer flavor, and I love, I love the way that the smaller knocked down fruit flavors kind of complement that, beer flavor. And so of course it like makes conceptual sense to me that second use hops that haven't been completely cached through that, first dry hopping process still have plenty to give to a beer in an interesting way. But you don't find that there's a extra kind of vegetal character to it, or that it tilts in any kind of unpleasant direction.
No, thankfully not. I am kind of, again, sampling sometimes multiple times a day, but and dropping hops as necessary. So, yeah, no, thankfully no green vegetal gross notes.
That's pretty fun and kind of cool, and speaks to the kind of long-term sustainability. Why throw away something as expensive as hops when they still have more life to them, and can make for another interesting beer after that first time. We should all be looking to decrease our waste stream, especially if it helps us produce something that is also really delicious and drinkable. Zooming out for a little bit, any fun projects that are that you find exciting on the horizon, or new areas that you are experimenting in, things that you may not have released yet that you're still playing with?
Yeah, so we were lucky enough to get a bunch of Syrah grapes, which grows beautifully up here in Washington. So we've got that in barrels. It's been there since about September or so. So we've done a couple different dosage rates. Did a fun little winemaker's technique called carbonic maceration. So we did some whole cluster, pulled the barrel head off, threw a bunch of whole cluster Syrah grapes in there, purged the hell out of it with CO2, and forgot about it for a couple weeks, and then proceeded to press and then rack our beer on top, and then other variations of whole cluster Syrah fermentation, and just pressed kind of must composition with our beer. So yeah, playing with grapes is always fun. Another kind of underrated ingredient, not underrated, but another ingredient that we should really embrace because of the availability up here. Other projects, just brewed a turbid-ish kind of raw stock beer with a healthy amount of aged hops, not our own. Those came from YCH. But yeah, trying to kind of see how our culture plays with those characteristics, and a healthy amount of raw wheat. I think in like the 35-40% range. And what else we got?
We got a few beautiful fruiter crafted fruiters in July. So we are kind of rolling out kind of a brand that's in between our saisons and our oak aged beers that comes out of the fruiter. So we did a beautiful Digard beer that spent some time lagering. So kind of going back to the earlier conversations about making these beers approachable and these oak aged beers. So that's kind of a fun project, to gathering that character that we get from a little longer aging without necessarily having a 12-month-old saison beer, but something that we can kind of brew and package enough quantity, kind of make it more available to everybody, so it can leave the tasting room.
Did you take advantage of that Food Crafters, buy in the middle of the pandemic, pay for it afterwards program?
We did. Thank you, Food Crafters.
I thought that was a fantastic way to, keep their folks working and also help, support brewers as they get through this difficult year. No, yeah. It was very cool. If we look at the next year or the next 2 years, I know we're still, kind of in this pandemic. There's some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully, we've got vaccines getting out there. Hopefully you'll see people back in the tap room. I imagine it's open in a limited way now, but potentially more throughout this year as things start to turn around more seriously. But what does the next year or two look like for Fair Isle, and and how do you see yourself 2 years from now?
I think a big part of it is just the fact that we did open, just 2 months after or 2 months before COVID. And so like the initial thing is like, there's a lot of things we wanted to do as a brewery, everything from like having events for our bottle membership to having customers at the bar to this kind of environment and place that we had originally set up and explored that we haven't really been able to utilize yet. So in the short term, that's kind of like a huge goal. And then the second one is to kind of, as we've been, the beauty of doing mixed culture beers too, not just hop focused beers, is that with the shutdown of COVID, we didn't have to dump beers because our beers have a long shelf life, and we can keep brewing even though we aren't necessarily looking at even though our sales might be slowing down in 2 months, we are brewing a lot of beers and putting away in oak. So I think we've put 300 barrels of beer in oak maybe since COVID. And so that kind of pipeline that we are growing is super exciting. So not only in the past 12 months, most people have had most of our stainless steel saisons only, but we've got this whole other kind of branches of beer, everything from really older oak aged beer that's going to see fruit one day to just beautiful nuanced oak aged beer. So eventually those will kind of start come to play and come into fruition. So that's really exciting.
What's the long-term goal for Fair Isle? How big, what's the goal in terms of how much beer you make and, in a year, and what that kind of ultimate brewery plan looks like?
I think the big thing for us, the goal is to get to a point where we are able to tip the scale a little bit, and that we are able to introduce people and to continue to share with them at least a greater appreciation of mixed culture beers, and as well as the community of people that kind of make the ingredients that goes into this beer. So that's the ultimate goal that we're about. And I don't know if there's a specific barrelage that we can aim for about that, but the goal is to introduce more people to the wonderful world of mixed culture beer.
Well, that sounds noble. And, from our perspective, I know that, Joe Stang, our managing editor, and I have both really been enjoying drinking your beers over this past year that you've sent out our way. And there is an accomplishment and a sophistication and a delicate beauty to them that we can really appreciate, that doesn't taste like a young brewery. And, and so congratulations to you all for producing beer that is so fine and so well considered right out of the gate with a young brewery. G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication. Get haze for days with Carry Bio Haze. Turn seltzer skeptics into supporters with craft concentrate blends from Old Orchard. Take full advantage of the enhanced marketing power of BreweryDB, and check the ABS commercial Facebook page to find out how to enter to win a Keg Viking. Of course, if you'd like to support this very podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, or if you're a professional brewer, check out our all-access subscriptions at brewingindustryguide.com. Andrew, if people want to learn more about Fair Isle or find a way to taste some of your beautiful farmhouse creations, where do they find you all?
Yeah, so check out our website, fairislebrewing.com. We have an Instagram account. And the cool thing about Washington is we can actually ship beer to everybody in the state of Washington. So find a friend if you don't live here, have them order beer online, and we'll ship it to them. We also are sending small amounts of beer to Oregon, California, and BC.
Very cool. We'll everyone out there, check them out. Andrew Pogue, Nick Pauley, Fair Isle Brewing, Seattle, Washington. Thanks for joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
Thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.